what people sort of, I'm not sure they articulated this, but I think what it amounted to was this, which is if we want to be democratic, we want to have a free market, we want all the stuff that they have in Western Europe, right? But not if it means that we have to give up our greatness, whatever the hell that means.
Paul, what we want to do is obviously keep this very big picture and really try and understand, the basic mechanisms that underlie this conflict. And I think what we need to talk about, which we've talked about a lot of topics in the past, is actually NATO at this point. Because one of the narratives has been is if NATO expansion forced Putin's hand, essentially, into doing what he did, right?
Yep.
So that's a very major topic that a lot of people are talking about. But before we even get to that, we'll keep that kind of question in the back of our mind. Let's just explain what NATO is, the purpose it served, if it's still serving a purpose, go on.
All right, so NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it's called North Atlantic because it included members in Europe, but as well as the United States and Canada. Founded in 1949, so shortly after World War II, and it was founded to deal with the danger of, in late 1940s Europe, that the Soviet Union, having conquered much of Eastern and Central Europe as a result of World War II, might not stop. Right, there was a big argument over who was going to control different parts of Germany, and in particular, had been a crisis over Berlin in 1948, in which the Soviet Union had basically surrounded the portion of Berlin that was given jurisdiction to for the United States and the UK and France after 1945. Basically, blockaded Berlin to try to force the Western powers out. So the idea was Russia, or the Soviet Union, is still a potential danger to Western Europe. And essentially it was an alliance that was both meant to help shape the rearmament of Western Europe against the Soviet Union after World War II, while also dealing with the fact that a lot of these countries had just been occupied by Germany and were afraid of Germany, and to sort of institutionalize then the role that the United States and only the United States could play in protecting that region against the Soviet Union. So as the NATO's first Secretary General, a British guy named Lord Ismay, said very famously, he said the role of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Part of the idea being that if you didn't have the Americans in, then the only way Europe was going to get protect itself would have been by a massive German rearmament campaign. And eventually, of course, by Germany getting nuclear weapons. And in the late 1940s and into the 50s and 60s, nobody wanted Germany rearming and getting nuclear weapons. And in fact, to this day, Germany, despite its obvious capacity to do so, still does not have its own nuclear arsenal. So I think that aspect of NATO, of allowing Germany not to rearm and allowing the other states of Europe not to have the fear of German rearmament, has sometimes been underestimated.
That was one of the purposes of NATO. But it seems the other purpose was to essentially stop the expansion of communist Soviet Union.
Oh, I mean, that was
that's a major.
Stopping communist expansion was the headline role of NATO. Doing it in a way that did not require German rearmament was the part that really required the U.S. to play a central role. Okay,
so that was the purpose of NATO.
Yep.
But as we know, in the early 90s, the Soviet Union fell. Was it 1989?
1989, the Soviet Union essentially gave up its control over its empire in Eastern Europe. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, which is when Ukraine became independent.
Okay, so that happened. So what purpose then did NATO serve beyond that point if the Soviet Union collapsed?
So there was a big debate about this at the time. There were those who said, okay, we can disassemble NATO because the Soviet threat is gone. And there were two different arguments against that that were related but were distinct. One was, well, the Soviet Union's gone, but Russia looks pretty shaky, And there are some nasty actors still active in Russia, and we don't know what's going to happen. So let's not rush to disband NATO. There was another argument that said NATO has this incredible capacity. We've built this incredibly well-functioning institution. There's plenty of roles in this completely transformed Europe that this institution can and should play. So rather than dismantling it, let's have it play some of these roles, such as consolidating and promoting democracy in these states that had been communist for 45 years, like the Czech Republic, like Poland, like Hungary.
Yeah, so those were communist states that eventually joined NATO.
That is
correct.
And
then Russia became a democratic state under Yeltsin. Why? What was the by name only maybe, but like ideologically, why was there no incentive for them to essentially become part of NATO then?
Well, I think there was always, and this does get to a really important point of the different perceptions on what post-Soviet, post-communist Europe should look like, which is there was some exploratory talks about Russia joining NATO. The problem was sort of twofold. One was that Russia really had this policy that it never really lost, that we have a special role to play in Europe. And basically nothing could be decided without us. So it wasn't really clear that Russia wanted to fit in with the mission of NATO. At the same time, I think there was worry within NATO that, technically every member of NATO has a veto over NATO policy and over new NATO decisions. And there was worry as to whether Russia was really part enough of the group in terms of seeing problems similarly to warrant bringing them into NATO. And the point that I would stress is, the Soviet Union collapses from, August through December of 1991. Some things happen in 1992, but particularly in Russia in 1993, to raise questions about whether Russia's going to endure as a democracy. And I'm one of those who argues that Russia's demise as a democracy really begins in the summer and fall of 1993. And so you really only had about 2 years in which Russia really looked like a democracy. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I think we have to take into account in understanding why NATO was not disbanded and why it in fact expanded was the conflict in Yugoslavia. We now talk about what's going on in Ukraine as being the biggest thing in Europe since World War II. Well, at the time, the wars that ensued in the collapse of Yugoslavia was the biggest thing in Europe that happened since World War II. And a lot of what was going on in Yugoslavia looked a lot like genocide. Right, the term.
Can you just give a brief overview of just what happened? It's a super complicated conflict. Yep. Yugoslavia, Serbia, yep. Obviously, but just kind of a high level, just overview of that.
Sure. So the long history is Yugoslavia is was a country in southeastern Europe in a region known as the Balkans, and the long history is that the Balkans historically were kind of where the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire bumped into one another. And so over the centuries, there was a jumble of populations that were religiously Orthodox, religiously Muslim, religiously Catholic, that sort of identified and had different languages, of course, Turkic-based languages, Slavic languages, and so on. So it was a mosaic of ethnic and national and religious identifications. Okay. After World War I, it was formed into a single country, a federation. Serbia, populated mainly by ethnic Serbs who were Eastern Orthodox and therefore tended to turn towards Moscow, and Croatia, historically populated primarily by Roman Catholics who had tended to look elsewhere, towards the Germanic world. Bosnians, who, again, predominantly Muslims, who I'm not sure really tended to look towards Istanbul, but didn't necessarily see themselves as being either Slavs or Catholics. Okay, so there's an immense amount of history. Let's get to the point. In 1991, largely because of what was going on in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, various parts of Yugoslavia start saying, we don't want to be part of Yugoslavia anymore. Yugoslavia was dominated by Serbia. and in particular, a country that's now called Slovenia, basically thought we can go much faster further towards Europe. Slovenia is located up on the border with Italy and Austria. Said, that's where we see our future. We're splitting off, right? Mm-hmm. And then Croatia, which historically had an enmity with Serbia, they wanted to split off. And so you got these republics declaring their independence from Yugoslavia. The problem was, and let's just take Croatia for a minute. Croatia declared itself independent, but there were a lot of people who identified as Serbs living in Croatia. Mm-hmm. And they thought, holy smokes, if we have to live under Croatia, they might come after us as Serbs. And there had been vicious fighting between Croats and Serbs during World War II. The Croats had tended to align with Germany, with the Nazis. There was a Croatian fascist movement called the Ustasha. So there was real history in people's memories to say, we can't live under these people. The Serbians in Serbia basically said something similar. We can't leave our Serb brethren to live under the Croats. We can't leave our Serb brethren living under the Bosnians. And so essentially they attacked. Mm-hmm. What they were trying to do, though, was to say, this territory is going to be ours. We're going to drive the other ethnic group out. And that's where mass slaughter came in and forced migration that we would identify. And
there was a genocide there, right?
Yep. Yes.
There was a genocide.
People argue over the use of that terminology, but I think it's fair in this case.
Mm-hmm. But essentially, the main point is there was this major conflict, and the need for NATO at that point was understood to be pretty essential.
Who was going to? So we had said after World War II, right? The mantra after World War II and the Holocaust primarily of the Jews as well as some others. The mantra was never again. Mm-hmm. And so there was this incredibly profound sense of, holy smokes, now that the Cold War's ended, we're not going to go back to that. But the question was, who could intervene to stop it? Mm-hmm. Well, and there you had NATO sitting there with its operational command. It was multinational, so it wasn't a single country going to be doing this. Of course, it had the warplanes. It had the infrastructure to run the bases. Mm-hmm. So NATO ended up running the mission that was authorized by the United Nations. The United Nations didn't have any planes, right? Mm-hmm. So NATO ends up sort of being authorized to do this. But there was a conflict from the very beginning as to exactly who was at fault and how this should be resolved. And so it basically, the Russians always took the side of the Serbs. Mm-hmm. NATO tended to see the Serbs as the aggressors. Mm-hmm. And so very early on, it seemed like Russia was in the way of stopping ethnic cleansing. Mm-hmm. And that was 1993. Mm-hmm.
It seems like there's all these competing national interests. And so then you have NATO, which is this alliance, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. It's expanded, and it has its own interests, right?
Yes.
So if you're not a part of NATO, can you view as these NATO countries essentially trying to exert their influence on other parts of the world and their power? And so that just brings about conflict in and of itself, doesn't it?
Well, I think there's always this question, right? And the same thing I think we could say about American power. You could say about NATO power, which, NATO power without American power is not quite the same thing. Mm-hmm. But the question always becomes, if not the United States, if not NATO, who?
Who for what? So because I think the essence, what we want to get to is, what is the higher ideological idea behind NATO, right? Like, what are they actually trying to do?
So you go back to World War II. Why does the United States, get involved in World War II? Well, because if not, Hitler just might take over the continent. Mm-hmm. So that seemed to be an important justification. Mm-hmm. You could argue, right? Maybe it wasn't worth it
to stop, autocratic, authoritarian domination,
to stop genocide, to stop the Jews in particular from being wiped out, and to stop all of Europe being run however it was that Hitler was going to run Europe, right? And of course, while the Holocaust was aimed primarily at the Jews, lots of other people were getting just extinguished by the Germans, and so there was a sense of that justifies, right, the United States intervening. In the case of NATO, the argument was people had seen what the Soviets had done in Poland. where 10,000 Polish army officers were basically just murdered because the Russians didn't want them around to raise objections.
When was this?
That was after when the Soviets took over. The Soviets made this deal with Hitler to divide Poland between them in 1939, right? Hitler invaded the western part of Poland, and that's when Britain and France declared war on Hitler and on Germany. The Soviet Union invaded the eastern part of Poland, what is today, a lot of that is today Western Ukraine, and immediately set about killing the Polish military leadership because they didn't want to have to compete with them later. Because they wanted...
What took place during that time period? I think there's this book called Bloodlands, I think.
Bloodlands is a fantastic book by Tim Snyder.
Yes. I think 14 million people on to the east of Hitler and to the west of Stalin, essentially exterminated due to policies by these two men.
Right. And when you say to the east of Hitler and to the west of Stalin, what you mean to say is Ukraine.
Yeah.
Along with not only Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. Today's Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, especially eastern Poland, is what Snyder calls the Bloodlands. And that is the area that between the wars was essentially a lot of Poland between World War I and World War II, as well as the Western Soviet Union.
So there are people who essentially believe that, okay, this is the higher ideological purpose of this. I mean, I think we could all be on the same page that we want to stop something like this from happening.
Yep.
But then we get into people's and national motives, essentially. Yep. And then another narrative is it just becomes about exerting American influence over the world, right?
Yep.
American imperialism over the world, right? And we see certain bad things around the world that can happen, whether it's propping up dictators, supporting, unneeded wars, there's so many different things you could say, essentially, right?
Absolutely.
And so I want to talk about this argument, the moral equivalence here. Let's talk about between American imperialism and Russian imperialism per se. Can you expand on that topic a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I'm gonna first sort of tell it in a kind of flippant way, which is I have a friend years ago when I was at the University of Kansas, a colleague of mine who was from Canada, and he would always complain about not just the stupid things that the United States did in the world, but the awful things the United States did in the world. And we'd have this conversation, and I would end up saying, yep, I can't argue with any of that. Would you rather the Russians ran the place, right, or would you rather the Chinese ran the place? And he'd always kind of say, okay, you got me, sort of thing, which is yes, the United States has a list of misdeeds, both misdeeds of commission and of omission, as long as my arm. I don't think that puts the United States in the same category as any other number of regimes who have, I would say, less frequently tried to do good things and screwed them up, and instead just tried to do bad things. There's a difference between a country that tries most of the time to do good things, sometimes tries to do bad things, and sometimes screws up the good things, versus a country that simply invades its neighbors, makes claims on others, and kills lots of innocent people. And I think if we lose that nuance, we're being both, I think, sort of historically inaccurate and morally bankrupt.
It makes us not take the type of moves we need to take to protect people to some degree, I think.
Absolutely.
When we start viewing everything as a gray area,
right.
Everything that we're doing could potentially be bad. I mean, there's bad actors in this world, and it's not necessarily for us to even say, what that is, but we need to have discussions about that, obviously.
So, for example, roughly the same time as the violence, the ethnic cleansing was going on in Yugoslavia, and NATO was getting involved, there was a genocide in Rwanda. And the United States took some very careful steps to avoid getting involved. In fact, the Clinton administration refused to call it a genocide because under international law, if it's a genocide, other states are obligated to get in and stop it. And so because the Clinton administration didn't want to get involved, they didn't call it a genocide. So why get involved in Yugoslavia and not in Rwanda? And I'm not sure you and I necessarily want to rehash that right now. But the point is, the United States can be criticized not for not just for the things it's done, but for the things it hasn't done. But the point I want to make is, right, I don't think anybody criticized Germany or China or Russia for not stopping the Rwandan genocide, because we just assume that the United States are the folks in the world that are supposed to do this.
Yeah, but I think what people see is this hypocrisy, I guess, right? People hate hypocrisy, and so when you go and you're saying, all you care about is human life, but then there's all these background national interests that might actually be driving policy. That might not come across as great. But I think your point is the strongest point, though. It's the matter of fact is that every country has screw-ups, but the intentions so clearly matter here, right? And I think that is something important to get into, is why we didn't go into certain conflicts where we probably should have gotten involved in, especially if genocide was taking place, right? Okay, so let's just go back.
So I would say is the United States get criticized, and again, I think a lot of the criticism is valid, but criticized at the same time for getting involved in things we shouldn't, and for not getting involved in things we should. And of course, line up 10 reasonable people and ask them to make the list of the shoulds and the shouldn'ts, and they're not all going to agree. So it's not as though it's simple and unambiguous what these policies should be.
No, Shadi Hamid recently wrote an amazing article for The Atlantic. Essentially, he wrote, there are many things worse than American power. Making the argument that now we see, especially certain aspects of the American left loves to kind of have this anti-imperialistic viewpoint, sometimes at the expense of the United States, not realizing there's so much worse going on. One of the points he makes is that Russia, rather than the United States, has been the world's most unabashedly imperialistic force for the past 3 decades.
Over the past 800 years.
Over the past 800 years, Russia has been, they've just consistently grown territory for...
Right. And the only thing that's, I'm sorry to say this, but the only thing that's ever really stopped Russian expansion has been somebody else's army. With the big exception was in 1991 when, because of the collapse of its sort of internal regime, Russia, let those other 14 states go, and of course is now trying to get some of it back.
So the argument, though, is that this is inherent to Russia, and I want to get to one point. So is Russia the way it is because of Putin, or is Putin the way he is because of Russia?
Right.
What is the
great question? And I think you're referring here because you and I have both now read this article by Stephen Kotkin. And Kotkin, for those who don't know, Kotkin's an historian at Princeton who's in the midst of writing a 3-volume biography of Joseph Stalin, and he's a scholar of the First Order. Yes, the work he's done on this Stalin biography is really phenomenal. But anyhow, he raises this question, right? Did Stalin make Stalinist Russia what it was, or did Stalinist Russia make Stalin the horrible person that he was? And I think it's a great question. And of course, it's a question that stretches across all of social science, right? Do people commit crimes because of the circumstances they find themselves in, or because they're bad people? This kind of thing. My view is yes, and, which is the famous line from Marx is, right, people make history, but not in circumstances of their own making. So Putin is both constrained, but he's also shaping his constraints, right? And he's one of those people who has more ability than most to shape his constraints. So I don't think we can merely say, I would not say, that Putin is merely he's merely an agent of history, and he doesn't have much free will here. But I think at the same time, we should take into account the constraints that he faces and so on. But the reason I push back against too much historical determinism, right, is Russia inherently this way. Well, anybody standing in Germany in 1945 would have said, this is the nature of Germany, right? And in fact, one of the plans that the United States hatched for post-war Germany was to basically turn it into an agricultural country, to get rid of all of its industry. Because the argument is Germany will never change, and the only way to stop it is to not let it have any weapons, right?
They would just become hyper-industrialized and go back to this war-making machine.
Exactly.
Luckily, we got them to make amazing cars instead, right?
But then again, that was one of the big reasons for one of the big reasons for keeping a couple 100,000 American troops in Germany after the war, and frankly in Japan as well, was for just in case, right? Just to make sure that didn't happen. But the point that I'm getting at is the Germany of 2022 is, I think we would all agree, a fundamentally different country than the Germany of 1938. At the same time, just to push the argument a little bit further, circumstances do matter. And if all of a sudden Russia is as nasty as it looks and the United States were to disband NATO and go home, I think we'd see Germany behaving differently. Mm-hmm. Because it would say, who's going to look after us? The Americans are gone. The Russians are coming. Maybe it's not.
It's environment and genetics, right? It's like it's a combination of both things, and oftentimes environment brings about people who are already inclined in certain personality traits that kind of heightens those aspects, right?
Yeah. The thing that happened in Russia, I think, after 1991 was people's inability to imagine that their country would not be a great power anymore. Mm-hmm. And to some extent to imagine that it was going to be this much smaller territorial thing. And, it's taken the United Kingdom since the end of World War I, 100 plus years or since the end of World War II, 80 something years to really get over the idea of the British Empire. So in that respect,
the sun never set, right, on the British Empire.
Yeah, and they still have the Commonwealth. The Queen is still the head of state of Canada, and so it's not unusual necessarily to. And I think about what would it take for the United States to get over the idea that we're, a global power and all this. That's hard for me to imagine. Yeah. And so in that respect, you think, that was sort of a big ask of the Soviet Union, of the leadership of Russia. But on the other hand, it was an incredible opportunity to say, we as Russians were not the Russian Empire, we were not the Soviet Union, and now we have this ability to sort of decide what it was that we are and we want to be. And they really struggled to do that and couldn't come up with anything other than we're a great power.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about this deterministic view of history, and I heard this crazy argument yesterday where somebody said that Russia needs a strong man to lead them, essentially. Like the nature of their people, they need that. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it just wouldn't exist, essentially. And this kind of argument kind of dumbfounded me in many ways, because even for me, it's like any nation, any person has the capacity to change, right, given the right circumstances and time.
Yeah. I mean, that argument has been made about Russia for hundreds of years. Sometimes it's made in terms of geography. The country is so vast that it could only be kept together. That it's so diverse. That it's got these external enemies, right? That's what Stalin or Putin would say, which is Russia can't afford democracy because we've got these these external enemies trying to divide us. Although I think one of the arguments that Kotkin makes, which I find absolutely compelling, is that authoritarianism, especially of the very closed authoritarianism that Stalin had and that we're now seeing with Putin, makes the country actually much weaker, not stronger.
Yeah, and that's because in democracies there are many self-correcting mechanisms that are not available to authoritarian regimes, right? Like everybody under Putin's circle at this point, anybody who disagreed doesn't exist, essentially, right? Whereas in democracy, disagreement is a major part of the process, an often messy process, but it gets to better outcomes over the long term. Is that a good way to...
Yeah, so I mean, think about, go back, 50, 60 years now. Think about the disaster that was the Vietnam War, right? Both the moral and political catastrophe that was the Vietnam War. Well, the United States has ever since then, right, has been sort of agonizing about the Vietnam War. And from the very beginning, there was dissent about the Vietnam War. So there are these mechanisms to try to, or that have a natural tendency towards at least trying to address some of your biggest faults. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you get rid of all the contrarian voices, nothing can ever get fixed.
And that's what's happening in Russia, right? Because, I mean, even with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, you could go protest on the street here in New York and Los Angeles.
And I did.
And you did. And you did protest. Yeah. And for the most part, unless you were resorting to violence, you were probably left alone.
That's right. I mean, I have to say, I was at some World Bank protests in Washington, D.C., this is probably 20-something years ago. It was in the mid-'90s. And the United States police, especially in Washington, D.C., are very good at keeping those protests from not getting too far out of hand, although this, January 6, 2021, not so much. But yeah, there are these mechanisms, and there's competitive politics, right? George W. Bush through the Iraq War, it was a disaster, and he didn't get voted out of office in 2004, but the Republicans got routed in the 2006 midterm elections. Joe Biden made a shambles.
And that brought Obama came to power. He was a direct consequence of George W. Bush's catastrophic failure. We decided we wanted someone who's almost completely different, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of things that worked in the election of Barack Obama. Yeah. But yes, Biden made a complete hash of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and yet that itself was a correction of an earlier policy, a policy that said, well, we can't get out because it's too complicated to get out. And of course, he was excoriated for it. And I think there's some case to be made that even in the 6 months since that's happened, the Biden administration has dealt with this situation much more effectively than it dealt with the Afghanistan situation.
Because we learned from those mistakes.
You learn from mistakes. If nothing else, you become humble, which never hurt a powerful leader.
No. Let's just get back to the point, we might have answered this to some degree. So as far as the NATO eastward expansion forcing Putin's hand.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
This is
okay.
Let's just dismantle this scenario.
Well, so look, there's no doubt that Putin is angry about that. But it's interesting to notice, since I've been following it since it happened, that his anger really only came afterwards. At the time, it's not that they thought this was great, but at the time it happened, this really is not what Russia was so worried about, because Russia, like us, assumed that we were going to get along just fine, right? In 1994, when the original informal decision was made, and then later in I want to say 97, but I'm not sure when the more formal decision, and then it was in 1999 that the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary formally became NATO members. At that point, there was still this assumption that we were going to get along pretty well, and it wasn't that big a deal. And that was true even a few years later when the decision was made to expand even further. So some of this is Putin projecting backwards on something that he didn't really object that strongly to at the time. But it's equally the case that it's important to ask, what would Central Europe look like now if NATO had not expanded? Would democracy have actually taken root in these countries the way that it has? Would we be in a situation where not only did we have Ukraine in the situation it's in, but Poland in that situation and Slovakia in that situation, because the Russians might be making claims on their territory? Because, of course, after all, a lot of Poland was part of the Russian Empire. And Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia were part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And so it's not clear that NATO enlargement caused any of this. It might actually have made things better. Things could have been worse without it. But the bigger point is there were lots of ways for Russia to respond to this other than by invading its neighbor. That's really the big point.
No, absolutely. And it's just interesting that this has just been a continued narrative about how we kind of did this. And it kind of goes back to this idea that it might have forced Putin's hand in the sense that now he had to fear for his livelihood, but not necessarily for the Russian sovereignty, though, right? I mean, meaning it wasn't really a threat to Russia as a whole, but for him, it might have been.
What it threatened was, to the extent that Putin and other Russians had the idea of re-expanding Russia, it threatened that. Right? Or the idea that even if they weren't going to take over this territory, that they were going to create some type of sphere of influence where those countries sort of had limited sovereignty because they couldn't take policies without the permission of Russia. It threatened that. And but I think part of it is not that sort of rational. Was there any chance that NATO was going to attack a nuclear-armed Russia, which seems incomprehensible? I think a lot more of it was wrapped up more in the symbolic politics, which is why Putin got angrier about it over time. And I think in a way, it's like this. The more he got frustrated about Ukraine not coming back in to Russia, the more he got frustrated about a bunch of other stuff as well.
It started like a feedback loop where
he just got madder about everything. But ultimately, this is my opinion, and I think this invasion, I think, contributes a lot of evidence that we didn't have 6 months ago, which is this whole thing is a lot more about Ukraine than it is about NATO. And one argument, of course, is to support that is, and this has to be obvious to Putin and to his advisors, right? What he's done by invading Ukraine is guarantee a massive resurgence of NATO. So
it's made the alliance stronger than ever. Would you say?
Absolutely, stronger than it's been since the Cold War. Yeah, I mean, NATO was expanding geographically, but militarily it was wasting away because these new, Poland, for example, right? Poland was still flying these old Soviet MiG jets. So as NATO was expanding in terms of its territory, it was not correspondingly bringing its military capabilities along, because arming the Polish military with F-16s and F-18s and so on was going to be monumentally expensive. And so while we were including more countries in the political institutions of NATO, militarily, we were, by the spending choices we were making, we were actually drawing NATO down. And now Putin has reversed both the political process and the military process. Now NATO's coming tighter together militarily, politically, and everybody's now realized they're going to spend more money. And of course, it might expand further territorially because now Finland and Sweden want in, or potentially want in.
Is this good for everybody? Is this good for Africa? Is this good for Asia?
That's a great question. I have to think. I have to think about this. I think the fact that this war has turned into such a disaster for Russia is a good thing for all of us. That is to say, every now and again, because we just tend to be stupid and forgetful, unfortunately, it seems we need a reminder every now and again of how destructive and counterproductive war is. And so for the countries that are not fighting in this war but are getting the reminder, and their neighbors are getting the reminder, that might be a good thing. To the extent that it reorients American spending, German attention away from those other countries, that's either a bad thing or a good thing, depending on your politics, right? If you believe that you want more aid from the West and that's good for your country, you might say, I'm afraid we're going to get less aid from the West now if we're in Africa or Asia somewhere. To the extent that you believe that aid from the West is simply another method of imperialism, then maybe you're happy to have the West distract.
Yeah. I mean, some of these countries, rightfully so, have grave concerns about. There's this colonial past, right, where essentially Western powers exploited Africa, Asia, extracted resources, and so there's this real fear that does this expansion bring about certain semblances of that.
The expansion of NATO?
Yeah, the expansion of NATO, the expansion of the West, the increase of Western power.
I think there's the argument to be made, of course, is that NATO has not been expanding into Africa, and in fact, this is the thing: is there's always more countries that want to be in NATO, right? Than NATO is necessarily going to let in, and this is, of course, the difference. And Ukraine's the perfect example of this. Ukraine said, we don't want to be in a Russian bloc; we want to be in NATO. The problem was NATO said, we're not sure we're ready for you yet. And the Russians said, we want you and we don't care what you think. Right. So this is the problem for a lot of countries around the world is they're sort of torn, as well they should be. Right. Do we want deeper integration with Europe in the West, or do we want less? And, in the 60 years after World War II, sort of, say from 1945 up till 2005, one of the things that happened over time was a recognition that isolating yourself from the most wealthy economies in the world was not a great recipe for economic development. So there's still a great debate to be had. Is there a path for development for the countries that still aren't developed in a global economy dominated by Europe, North America, and parts of Asia? And I'm not an economist, but I think that's an interesting debate to have.
And one of the things I want to get to, we use the term the West a lot, right? Like we talk about Western liberal democracy, expanding the values of that. I just want to bring up something that I read from Stephen Kotkin, actually, when he was asked to define the West. And I think this is really important. He said, the West is a series of institutions and values. The West is not a geographical place. Russia is European, but not Western. Japan is Western, but not European. Western means rule of law, democracy, private property, open markets, respect for the individual, diversity, pluralism of opinion, and all the other freedoms that we enjoy, which we sometimes take for granted. We sometimes forget where they came from, but that's what the West is, right? And I think there's sometimes confusion in that it's a very nationalistic orientation when we talk about the West in that way. But is that fair to describe the West as how Stephen Kotkin described it?
Yes, and I think it's important. The point that he makes about Japan, and of course I would add South Korea and Taiwan as well, is it's not geographically limited. And one of the important concepts about whether we call it the West or whether we just want to call it the free world or liberal democracy is it's a club with very open doors, right? And I think that's the great tragedy and the lost opportunity of the post-Soviet era is that door was never closed to Russia. But Russia sort of made a series of decisions that ultimately amounted to saying we're not going to go through that door because we don't like the terms that are on offer. And of course, China is making much the same decision, right? The sort of deal that the United States in particular, but the West in general, thought it was making with China 25 or 30 years ago was, you're going to liberalize economically, and in time you will liberalize democratically as well, and that will make us all better off. And what China has instead saying is, we want to engage with you economically in a way that drives our political competition with you. And I understand that from a nationalist perspective, and I understand that given China's centuries of domination by Western powers. But those choices, of course, will have consequences. And you can fault the West, I think, for saying, and I think many people in Russia fault the West for saying, you can join the club, but only on our terms, right? And part of the Russian thing has been to say, wait a second, we're Russia. We don't join clubs on other people's terms, right? We join clubs on our terms, or we negotiate terms. And NATO and the EU have basically said, right, and they've said this not just to Russia, but to everybody. Poland, if you want to join the EU, you have to adopt what we've already laid down. And there are a lot of countries that are going to say, no, that offends our sense of sovereignty or our sense of national pride and so on.
In NATO, no one's forcing them either, right? We're not forcing their hand to necessarily join this club in this manner.
No, and,
right?
and in fact, again, the Ukrainians more recently, of course, have been saying we want into NATO. NATO said, well, we don't think we want you. But of course, if you go back 10 years before the invasion of 2014, Ukraine, the polling in Ukraine showed even the Ukrainians were pretty split, maybe slightly negative overall on joining NATO.
Yeah. The world can be such a complex place. And I think how you broke it down earlier is a great framework to use. Is what type of society do you want to live in?
Right.
What type of society do you want to raise your family in? What type of society do you want to raise your kids in? And I think over and over and over again, people make that decision.
Yep.
And it's pretty obvious what direction that decision usually goes in, right?
I think this is an interesting question, right? The sort of liberal view of the world, and I mean liberal in the sort of historic European sense, not in the American political sense. The liberal view of the world, liberal meaning focused on freedom, has tended to assume, right, that in the long run, the history is going to bend towards freedom and towards liberal democracy, and we certainly tended to assume that in the years following 1989. There are those now who are arguing, right, that no, that was an historical epic, and that's not the only way that history can go. right? And so
Biden said that he laid that out. He said it's between democracies and authoritarianism is the future. These are the lines being drawn, and these are the choices that have to be made.
And I want to say, I think in Russia, and I think this is probably true in China as well. Although I've spent less time, in China and with the Chinese. But I think in Russia, what people sort of, I am not sure they articulated this, but I think what it amounted to was this, which is, if we want to be democratic, we want to have a free market, we want all the stuff that they have in Western Europe, right? But not if it means that we have to give up our greatness, whatever the hell that means. And people don't have to necessarily even think through concretely, well, what does Russian greatness mean? All you have to do is feel it, right? And again, I think that's what's so interesting about Germany, because Germany lost World War II. It sort of took the opportunity to say, we can, and Japan, the same thing. It's like, we can get rid of that whole greatness thing and be liberated from it.
And they prospered. I mean, those societies were completely devastated after World War II, but they were rebuilt in a way that they became the major economic powers of the modern era, right? Right,
but is anybody scared of Germany? Or is anybody scared of Japan? And the answer is no. And so maybe if you feel like, wait a second, I want to live in a country that people are scared of, or that people can be scared of if we choose to scare them.
There's something to that, right? That's like human nature. Like we want to be feared, right?
We like the option of being feared. I'll put it that way, right?
Well, it's just so fascinating. Like I said, it's endlessly complex, and I think we got so many good discussions here, even for future topics. And once again, Paul, this has been really enlightening. We will continue these every weekend. It's weekend office hours. Thank you so much, Paul, for having this discussion.
Thank you. Always stimulating.
Awesome.
You make my brain bigger, and I appreciate it.
Same here. So that's great to hear. It's mutual.
Thanks.
All right. Take care.
Take care. You too.